Oh, and let me attach the link to the slides. I always do this. Again. Okay. So let's just pull this up on your screen. Here are the slides. And let's get started. Okay, so welcome to week 7, Fossa Group 2. We are more than halfway through the course, so this is exciting. Bravo, congratulations. Today we're going to dive deep into climate justice, reconsidering climate development, and if we have time, theory of change. We have a special guest speaker. If you haven't already, please fill out the mid-course survey. If you want to use just like 2 minutes while I go through the agenda, please do. We're going to have a quick breakouts. We're going to have a climate justice debrief, then a climate justice review. Everything is going to be very discussion-based, so please participate. We're going to reconsider development models and development systems, as we started talking about last week, hopefully get to theory of change, and then some announcements for the week to come. So I'm going to break you guys into breakout rooms. I offer 2 questions. You can touch on both. The first is any climate change area that either you're most interested in that you knew already coming in, something that's grown on you or excited you, where you want to go forward. We're going to dive deep into solutions coming up. So just focusing more on that. And then a question I tend to ask people is, are you as a human, you're mountain, forest, jungle, beach, or desert? What's your chosen climate? Hopefully we're all earth lovers, so we love all 4. But I think this is an interesting way to get to know people. So feel free to keep that up. I'm going to break us into smaller breakout rooms. And we're going to reconvene in about at around 10:08. Sound good? Anyone have any questions? So let's do 2 to 3 per room. People are coming in. Okay, let's do this. So we'll come back at 10:08. So, well, based on the Terra class, I would think Jesse has been driving for the past 7 weeks. Hi, Jesse. Yeah, I'll share the link to the slides again right here. Okay, anyone have any interesting thoughts with your breakout room? Learn anything new about your fellows? Have any overlaps in interests? Okay, was anyone a mountain? We can do this one. Mountains? Beaches? Nice. Deserts? We got one. And forests, jungles. Okay, so we're a mountain and beach kind of people. I got it. All right. So, Alistair, did you want to say something, or you were raising in solidarity with the mountains?
With the mountain. I will say I've been reading a lot about the upcoming COP conference, and it feels very disappointing, particularly in light of some of the class stuff that we're doing. I read that all the countries in the Middle East were looking at negotiating oil deals around the conference, which felt really like. But anyway, I'm sure we'll find an opportunity to talk more about that.
You're segueing us right into it. And last week we touched briefly, and one of the articles was the deep irony of Petrostate UAE being host of the climate of COP28. So we can bring
Well,
that
and
up
the
again.
CEO of the National Oil Company is, in fact, the guy chairing the conference. It just seems ridiculous, but
that's for sure. So we're going to have a lot of time to talk about this today, thankfully. So let's segue into it. So today we're going to dive deep into climate justice, which Alistar, that segues us perfectly. You guys all see my screen?
yep.
Okay. So we're getting into a topic and into a fact that we can't discuss climate change without discussing climate justice. So this weekend I was having dinner with my family. We were speaking about what's the connection between climate justice and climate change. And I was trying to find the words, that activity of how can I explain a concept that makes sense to me to someone else. And the metaphor that came up for me was right now we have, for example, with the pharmacology, pharmaceuticals industry, we keep the shape of a broken system and we give a medicine in order to treat patients under the guise of that same broken system rather than changing the system itself. And so I think as we go into this discussion of climate change and we look at solutions and we come as students trying to understand how to go forward, where we're going to make our impact, is starting to understand that right now we do have a chance to rebuild entire systems, which can simultaneously feel overwhelming and it can also feel inspiring. And so going back to the narratives of multi-solving and zooming out and the complexity and how we can create solutions that are not from up here, but actually from the ground, there's an incredible opportunity to do so. So I attached some articles, some reports that are useful. One is from the EPA. Sorry, it's going to be heavily US based, but just understanding how income, how socioeconomic status, how population demographic and density, how geography affect people's experience with climate change. So these are some interesting articles and reports we can go through. This is a map. I'm very visual heavy, so understanding who are all of the players within this conversation. And part of this question of climate justice is relating directly to health, right? So I don't know if any of us have experienced health consequences of climate change. I personally did when the wildfire smoke hit New York. But anyone has experienced that can, attest to the vulnerability that you feel and the helplessness that you feel about your own health and when climate change actually comes into the house. So health outcomes, social and behavioral context, climate drivers, environmental institutes, everything, all of this tied together in this visual. You can dive deeper into the source. Right, we saw the wildfires throughout California. We saw floods throughout wildfires throughout Hawaii. And over here is a really beautiful expose as well that I thought they did a great job reporting. So let's open it up discussing the climate justice session that we had this week. Who was able to attend or watch the recording? Raise a hand. Okay. So if not, just a general overview is we're discussing how different groups are affected by climate change. That's what we're here to do in Terra. That's why we have a global cohort. And some of the themes that we touched upon in this climate justice workshop were inequalities, social inequalities, and climate impacts, the role of intersectionality, the equitable or inequitable flow of climate finance, which we'll touch on more as we progress in this course. Net zero, again, understanding what net zero means and net zero targets and if they're even realistic as we go into COP28. And this big question, which is, will the green transition be just? So I want to just open it up to a group discussion. If anyone joined in, right? What did you think of the workshop? And beyond that, what stood out? What did you learn on? What irked you? What bothered you? What's something you want to go forward in? So we can just have it open if you want to raise your hand in the Zoom, and then we can just jump right in.
Can I go, Kat? Nobody else
Yeah.
is getting started. Yeah, I think this was one of the more engaging, how do I say it, hit home, I think, this section, because I come from India, I live in Chennai, and I live in a fairly vulnerable region, which is subject to floods and probably cyclones almost every single year. So just watching, I think the initial video that Muskan shared, it was fairly long, but I think that video was very hard hitting, and it's worth it for everybody to watch because it was very informative on the topic of climate justice. And it hit home because I think in my line of work as well, I really see how poorer and more vulnerable communities are really impacted by climate change. It's not their fault where they're born, where they live, their housing, their access to health and sanitation facilities. All that is really not their fault, but they're just so unequally affected by the effects of climate. So I think a lot of communication, behavioral change communication, educating young people is very critical to not only climate change but climate action and climate justice. So that the session was very like interesting and it was just very real and raw, I felt.
Anyone else who attended the session or didn't attend the session?
I think one of the things that we discussed in our breakout group that I thought was an interesting discussion was a little bit the urgency of solving climate change, kind of like to what extent is it a trade-off or not, right? Like we all agree that climate justice is really important, and that it's key to have a justice lens as you think about the transition. But there were a few in our group that felt, well, but we need to solve this now, and in democratic societies, kind of the discussion of all these different groups might just make it much harder to get to a consensus. So I thought that was an interesting discussion. I grew up in Colombia and travel around the world, so I think for me, kind of the justice piece is really important. But I get kind of the is there a trade-off or not question. I thought that was interesting. The other thing that we discussed that was an interesting discussion is to what extent should we, and I guess this is a little bit the degrowth and versus growth models, is like rethink our models. And I think a good example of this is in the US, the whole push for EV cars. Well, yeah, it's great, but at the same time, wouldn't it make more sense from a justice perspective to rethink the way transportation worked in the US instead of having everyone drive everywhere? Think of this transition as an opportunity to build more public transportation systems or more walkable cities. So anyway, I think those 2 points were interesting from our discussions during that session.
Anyone else want to share on this question? We also were, oh yeah, okay. Let's go with Apple and then
just one comment, like I felt the session, I mean, I thought it was very cool, but I think if there could have been more discussion in the session, it would have been good because it was a very long and very packed session. And I think there was just a little bit of discussion at the end. So that was sort of one feedback that I had after watching it. The other feedback I'll just share, I mean, I'll just say it. It's something that I sort of feel like, I think if you guys watch Salimul Haq's talk, which he gave, he's passed away now, but he gave a really good talk on what happened about the negotiations around COP and how they were actually able to get the loss and damage fund in place. But I'm sort of with him where I feel like there's this pragmatism which you have to have. I think that we live in an unjust world. I don't think while we sure we can ask for it, we should demand for it, but I don't think it's ever going to actually happen. It's ever going to be like the US or the countries in the global north. I don't think realistically they're ever going to actually do what they need to do to sort of ensure there's justice. But I don't want it to distract, or I don't think we should distract away from the issues. So I think that there's a chance of that might happen. So I think something that sort of Dr. Salimul Haq addressed in his talk, where he says that, we just agreed to everything that they said because they just want to, move on and get the actual the actual thing in place, get the mechanism going. So I think that's the more pressing need of the hour. Because we don't have time left. That's why I'm saying this.
Take.
Yeah.
Alistar, did you want to share?
I just, as I was going through the class material, and then over the last few weeks, I've just been really stuck on this disconnect between how much more needs to happen in a short period of time by the kind of developed world with the power, versus, the rate at what's actually going, and not having a sense for how you unlock this disconnect between, the haves and have-nots, the haves being the ones that actually have to make more aggressive, almost somewhat redistributive decisions around their behavior, and the fact that to date, a lot of the behavior has been incrementality when it feels like there needs to be step change, right? And it doesn't undermine, what the power of sort of bigger, more collective groups. But I just look at it like there was that little section in the course where they were talking about, how aggressive the oil companies have been in lobbying since the 1960s, right? And you just get a sense for what you're up against. And so, I'm stuck on just trying to figure out what's that unlock or that bridge, right? That actually creates that ability to shift the power balance, because it still is feeling to me very overwhelming. So that's just an observation.
Yeah. Anyone else want to join in? So basically, the key climate justice takeaway from this talk that I want us to, there's no answers, right? But to keep us on our mind and keep engaging in this question, and not to table this question because it's difficult, but to actually go deeper into it, is those who have most likely done the least in order to increase emissions are sometimes the ones who experience the climate impacts the greatest. And beyond that, have the least ability to actually make a change in those climate disasters that are affecting them, right? So what we want to say and what we want to take away, ideally, in an ideal world, is that the most responsible have an obligation to help those who are the most heavily impacted. And the question that we are left standing with is then, how do we build that bridge in an actual meaningful way that's not just jargon and not just discussion? And that's what we're actually here to do. We're going to go forward. I'm not going to put forward any solutions right now, but we're going to speak briefly as we go forward about this concept of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Sorry, this gets into very technical jargon as well. But according to this principle, and this is what many countries say they go by, is that each country's emissions reduction targets are to be set based on their historical contribution and their respective abilities to address this problem. So it's not actually looking at future-based emissions, it's looking at historical emissions. And reading this fact, I asked the group the question, do you think that one, this is justifiable? Do you think that this is a principle that makes sense? Do you think that this is something we're seeing in our real world? Or how would you approach it in a different way or rephrase this statement? Anyone want to take a shot? So a question that we had, actually Angela asked this question when we were speaking in a one-on-one. She said, we're talking about this number that's basically the number 0 in comparison to when we talk about 1.5 and 2. And she asked this question, what is the number of 0? What is that 0 degree number? What was the actual temperature of the planet at that time? That is our reference point for how much we're warming. What's that number? And I didn't have an answer for her. So in that moment when we were speaking, I realized so much of what we speak about in terms of making climate action are grand statements that we might not have even the most basic facts about. And so what I invite you to do as we think about climate justice is getting really familiar with your country's emissions, is getting really familiar with your country's slices of the pie, getting really familiar with the actions that your country is actually taking in order to address. And when we speak about this, not just dividing your world into, you know, developed and developing, or the have and have nots, but really understanding what is the percentage that my country needs to eliminate in our emissions or compensate in our emissions in order to create a fair and just and beneficial world. And again, this brings in the discussion of corporations. This is a report I highly recommend everybody going through as we touch upon climate justice. It's really easy. There's amazing graphs throughout it. So just taking a glance at this, we can break down emissions by country, but we can also break down emissions by class, right? And for me, I often look a bit deeper into that. So we have the top 1% of emitters, 17% make up the top 1% emitter. The top 10% of emitters are responsible for close to half of the world's individual emissions. So the share, right? So when you see this, if you just look at the right side, 17, 31, 40, 12, it doesn't look so incredibly off base, but understanding that 1% accounts for 17% of population share and understanding why is really key, whether it's connected to transportation systems or food consumption or electricity, understanding what causes that huge gap in lifestyle, in emissions, in impact, understanding the nuances of it beyond. Again, this is diving deeper, and these are useful graphs. I attach always the sources underneath, so please feel free to look at them. But understanding not just greatest amount of emissions, but understanding greatest amount of emissions per capita. Because if you look at a graph, you'll probably see that either China or the US are the highest emitters. But then when you look at a country, this was surprising for me, like Saudi Arabia, which for this year was the highest per capita. It's because there's been so many oil leaks and spills and gas emissions. And so just understanding not to take the information at face value. This is called, the graphic on the left is from a source called The Visual Capitalist. They have some really useful graphs, so I recommend looking at them too. So again, talking about per capita emissions. So understanding that all and every single country across the globe, the high income groups are always emitting more than the low income groups. All low income groups emit less than their population's fair share. Fair share is a concept that we should be getting familiar with. And understanding that this justice conversation is actually very front and central in climate negotiations. Whereas we have a tech world that's kind of in a fissure from maybe the governmental world. In governmental discussions, climate justice is always at the forefront, which kind of can sometimes make this pause in development and pausing going forward, especially if you've ever worked in any kind of governmental or public sector legislation in climate change. Sometimes the justice aspect can slow things down, but it's critical in making meaningful change. So I want to pose the question, do we think, we have people from all over the world here, do we think that any single country, irrespective of its share of global emissions, should be allowed to increase its GHG emissions? Or we can phrase the question in a different way. Does every country have an equal responsibility to reduce its GHG emissions? Or we can think about another question that I'll put forward. Who's actually responsible for the climate problem? And who should take responsibility and to what extent? Do a provocative one.
Happy to give some response already if you want.
Yeah.
On this one. So, I mean, it's all around the swaying question, basically. You have, when I read the last lenses, I was just thinking about it, the fact that historical contribution, I mean, in the end, it would be fair that each person on this planet has the same carbon budget, right? He's allowed to use, and that you generally bring that down altogether. Another way to look at it is that in the discussion I had climate in the Netherlands is that people say we're such a small country and it doesn't really make a difference. But then I always say, but we are so rich. So if we don't do it, how can we expect other countries which are much less rich to do it as well, right? I think it's difficult to allow any country to go up in greenhouse emission, but I would say the rich countries and the large that have emitted a lot they actually should contribute to poor countries to do their work as well, right? It's a large gap to bridge because they already find it difficult to do their own work. So my statement would be, in the end, it should be spread per person, and not per country.
Interesting take. And that can get us into scope 1, 2, and 3 as well. That comes into the conversation. So at least I touched in the beginning class, right, about COP28. We spoke about it last week, and there was a report that I listened to this week that said despite 3 full decades since the first COP conference happened, it's been 30 years, we remain so far from limiting our warming to reaching 1.5. And not only that, in these 30 years that we've been having these discussions is when the highest percentage of our emissions has actually taken place. And so with more discussion, we actually have greater emissions. And so we're hosting all of these conferences, and we're accounting and taking countries' pledges, for example, taking countries' pledges for COP27, and yet not a single one, as we discussed last week, of their NDCs actually put them in line with the 1.5 warming agreement. And so this gets us into conversation. Shelley, you kind of brought up that it's not just climate discussions and negotiations across countries, but also within countries, right? If you take your country and you break it down, who in your country is receiving the greatest effects, the brunt of the extreme weather of climate change, and who's the ones who are actually causing it, and what's their connection, what's their dissociation? Yeah, Regine.
Yeah, so this made me think about, like, in the US in particular, like the climate justice conversation. There's the global climate conversation, but we're also maybe assuming that everyone is at the same place, which is not true. I'm thinking of like the people that live in the vicinity of, like Cancer Alley, which is essentially like where all the petrochemical facilities are. There's a lot of communities and these were policies based at the time when US was segregated and, a pretty, I guess, like racially more unequal, and okay with that. So you had highways, right, infrastructure cutting in through communities. And so like these places, right, like physically these people are, they have like a higher proportion of like public health impacts. And I know there's a lot of work and studies the government's commissioning on like cumulative impacts. And I was thinking about that when we're talking about like climate justice and, the climate problem, because I think the cumulative impact is also really important and not separate, because, the folks that are most vulnerable are experiencing the cumulative impacts, whether it's like the global south or it's like the folks that live in the Gulf in the US and other regions. And I think you have to, at least I feel like we have to also like ask the question, like, how do any changes, any impacts, any policies, like how does it not continue to like have these compounding negative impacts on the same people? So for me, I understand it's difficult, but maybe it's difficult because our systems weren't designed that way initially. So it's always been separate, but I feel like this is an opportunity to make that change. And I do feel like in terms of like the responsibility piece, like that to me is, I don't know, I feel like it's like the place I have to like start to think about, because people have been impacted differently. And, when you get into the case of, the cumulative impacts that the same people are getting, I think then, you really have to have an answer for that.
Any thoughts? Thank you, Regine. Yeah. So again, just diving a little bit deeper in that and looking at what's going on this slide, right? This concept of fair share. this is a subjective question. This is a question that gets us into those moral conflicts of how much does a person need in order to survive? And does one person, right? Are we supposed to have a certain number? Do you think we should set a standard for how many emissions, irrespective of your country, irrespective of your lifestyle, you're allowed to emit? Is that a solution that we could make? What if we said, Michelle, bringing in your concept of we need to, what about thinking about the individual rather than thinking on a country-wide basis? So would then we propose putting forward a number of emissions that each person, irrespective of their country, income status, wealth, is allowed to emit? Should we make one number that's global, like 1.5? Or are we gonna look at the reality, look at the lifestyle of people? This person's already using air conditioning 24/7 hours of the day and has 7 cars, so he should be allowed to have the 7 cars, right? These are real questions. So how would we navigate that? How would we, goes into the question of taxation. This goes into the question of how do we actually want to rebuild our systems? What do you guys think? Should we have a certain number of carbon emissions that's allowed per person around the world, irrespective of where you're from?
Kat, I think that question reminds me of kind of the first one you posed previously, where, is anyone allowed to, or should people be allowed to increase their emissions? And I think it's an interesting prompt, especially when we're in this like really transitory moment of not allowing people to do that means that people who have less without having like greener options don't have the opportunity to, like, that really impacts their ability to improve like their station. And so it's like, which is the evil that you choose?
Apple, you want to share?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great idea. Like, thanks, Michelle, for coming up with that idea. And I think that's a great idea. And I think that should be the basis of the loss and damage fund, which is being set up. Because actually there is a mechanism to address this very issue. It is called the loss and damage fund, which they're trying to, they've been fighting. I mean, the sort of countries in the global south have been fighting for a long time. Finally, the global north has sort of agreed to it. And the global south has given away all their concessions. They said, okay, you guys call it what you want to call it. We'll agree to everything you want, just get it going. I'm hoping that this time actually money comes into it, because sadly, even though they've all agreed to it, there's no way enough. No one's actually putting any money in. Although on their own individual personal capacity outside of this framework, there are countries like Scotland and some other countries are actually contributing. So that's good news. But yeah, I think it's a great idea. It should happen.
Dimitri?
Like I'm not an expert in this, but like my only trepidation around an idea like that is it's sort of like you're like displacing the responsibility and onus on like individuals, whereas like a lot of the responsibility is probably on like an institutional level, right? Like corporations and like governments. And I don't just want to like defer blame like, oh, corporations are bad, right? But like it's sort of like there's all these challenges, and then now like an individual is paying for it. And I'm not suggesting they shouldn't. And like to Appa's point earlier, like maybe it's irrelevant because like it's a problem that needs to be solved. But it's like individuals at the same time don't have the like maybe tools around them to like innovate and like find other solutions and alternatives. Like, why would we not just put caps on what like a corporation can do and force them to innovate? And if we believe in like, different economic systems, like within those realms, force them to innovate and like create alternative solutions. I'm not saying this to like justify an individual continuing to have the right to like emit more than others. I agree there's like, a disparity, but I don't know. I'm hesitant to like defer the responsibility over to individual people, particularly as others have noted when like a lot of individuals, like, it's easy to blanket like, the US or Europe as like, the ones responsible for the most emissions, but like to Regine's point, like there's a lot of folks maybe in like the Gulf states who like, it's not like they're like disproportionately benefiting from this. They're probably being like harmed by it as well. So it's really challenging to just blanket, I think, individuals and force them to change when I'm not particularly sure that, on an individual level, like a common person is the one who's most responsible, when it's probably institutions who granted are made up of individuals, but it's probably these institutions who have disproportionately, and circumstantially, contributed to the challenges.
Yeah, maybe there we can also offer, instead of a but an and, right? It doesn't need to be only corporations have the limitation and individuals don't, or only individuals and corporations get their way. But in an ideal world, right, maybe we can find a way that it can be not but and always substituting that in our climate solving minds as we go forward, this concept of multi-solving and systems thinking, not but and. Just putting that forward. Michaela?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Dimitri was saying. I agree with him to some extent and think that it is the individual's responsibility and the organization or corporations to back into their business models, to back into their business models in a way that says, how do we bring our products and services to market while keeping this emissions cap per individual at its limit? So not, overproducing and driving demand that's beyond what we're supposed to be consuming. So yeah, that's just a thought that I had.
Remodeling the entire consumerist economy that we live in of sell more, sell more, sell more. It's a good ideal thought. Michelle?
Yeah, so maybe two things. So when I mentioned the idea of a budget per person, I mean, you could start by nations having a budget which is indicated on the same amount per person. So that's, you can still look at it at a constitution level. But the other thing I was thinking that there's a growing number of people that would like to live climate well. It's quite difficult. If I look at my life, how do I know I do it right? And if there was like a guideline, and if you would have tools that could calculate this your carbon spending now, and this how you could offset it, I could decide to spend a bit more money. I mean, there's a difference of what people have in richdom, and we can just not equalize it in the next year easily. But you could give people the opportunity to decide to spend more money and then make them feel better because they live climate rightfully. And it's quite difficult. You need to invent a lot of that right now yourself. So I've been playing with the idea, could you develop an app or something where you could look at your life and then find opportunities? And maybe if people start to consume that way, it might be an opportunity for companies to then say, oh, if you use my products, hey, you're easily climate neutral because I have a better proposition for you. So that's something that I as a consumer are missing, the easiness and information to do that.
You mean to calculate your carbon footprints?
Yeah, for example, but also manage it in a simple way. And so what are things to offset it? What are things to reduce it?
Right. I feel like in my experience, the calculation piece is available, but the action piece afterwards is really less so, right? Yeah. You can do a carbon footprint assessment very fast online in basically any form, but to understand, okay, well, now what can I do to substitute? That's, I would say, if anyone interested in this field of emissions, that action piece afterwards is, in human terms, is really quite missing. Chad?
So this is the climate justice is actually an issue I struggle with a bit because I find it very complicated. And you phrase the questions in a great way about, any single country or individuals, how should they be able to emit? Should they be able to increase their emissions in terms of justice and fairness? I tend to think of it through a lens of if every degree or 0.1 degree of warming is disproportionately affecting the poor, the global south, the people with the less means, right? Then if we're fully focused on reducing emissions as a total, as much as possible, that is in a way climate justice, right? Because if we're reducing emissions, reducing the increase in temperature, right, as much as humanly possible, that is disproportionately helping, right, those who would be most affected, which are the poorest. So in my mind, like aggressively attacking it as much as possible, and I think aggressively attacking the issue as much as possible is getting the highest emitters to reduce as much as possible because they're the highest emitters. That's the biggest bang for the buck, right? So I think resolving climate change as fast as possible, as effectively as possible, is an improvement in climate justice, because those are the people who are, struggling the most are the ones that are going to be the most affected when there are climate disasters, for example, due to climate migration and things like that. So I can kind of get bogged down in different aspects of social justice, but then I think like the simple answer is, if we solve this as soon as possible, we really do help the people who are most vulnerable the fastest. And I think that's something that when I start thinking about all the aspects of climate justice, sometimes I lose that simplicity and I have to bring myself back to it. Like, we need to resolve these things as quickly as we possibly can to help the most people we can. And sometimes it doesn't, I feel like that gets lost in the sauce a bit.
Yeah. I think that's also when we're talking about being solution oriented. We're going to speak later about theory of change, understanding who is your audience, right? Especially even in this Terra course, we can, get so deep into jargon and discussion and technical terms. And I want us all to imagine, as we talk about this term, the poor, or, lower income countries, these things that are so vague and so buzzworded. Imagine yourself standing in front of someone, right? A farmer who's lost his land because of floods and monsoons and wildfires. How would you engage in that discussion on climate justice when you're standing face to face with someone who's actually experiencing the impacts of this thing, right? Like, we're all sitting together. We've all paid for this course. We've all, professionals, or maybe we're unemployed right now, but we've been in the workforce before. How would we change our narrative if we were sitting face to face with someone who's actually experiencing this, one of the people who are quote unquote poor that we speak about? And just every time we get up here and theoretical, trying to close your eyes and just bring it down to the realness of what that situation would be like and look like. Thank you guys for the conversation. So this is graph. You can dive deeper into it. There's a source in the speaker notes in the slide deck. So this is just a little bit of insight into climate finance for developing countries, which we're going to speak about after our screen break. So understanding public investments, private investments, multilateral. I'm not the biggest finance person, but if anyone has any things that jump out looking at this graph that surprise you, please feel free to share. Anyone have any thoughts looking at this?
I would say this is more specific to like the regenerative ag space that I've been doing research in. But I've had this sort of like access to capital, and this is also a US-centric viewpoint, but this access to capital challenge come up to me or come across my radar in conversations. And I'm asking the question right now of like, if you had capital, what would you do with it? And I think that's sort of the double click here of like, sort of where do funds go? How do they get mobilized? And like, is it like a matter of access? I think like finance, unfortunately, becomes so opaque for people, and is probably intentionally kept that way to some extent. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that I've been thinking about very recently. I don't have totally complete thoughts on it, but that sort of struck me of like, if you have access to funds, what do you actually do with them? And like, why don't you have them now?
Stay tuned. This is a good segue into post screen break discussion that we're going to have. So thank you for that. Alistair?
Yeah, I mean, what jumps out for me here, and it's related to this thing I've been wrestling with the last several weeks, is, it feels like mobilized private needs to be 3x what we see on this chart. And I got stuck in the class this weekend on this notion of a pact with the devil, because I don't see how you mobilize the private sector, who are very large contributors to this problem, unless you create a profit motive incentive to get them engaged, right? Public sector tends to be better at understanding the full cost and impacts and making allocations of capital appropriately. But the private sector doesn't unless there's a motivation there. And so when I look at this data, I love this chart, right? This sort of confirms a whole bunch of things I thought, which is, if you want step function change in big emitters in the private sector, that sort of piece of the pie needs to be much, much larger. And there needs to be some incentive for them to come in, not just altruism, because they're just not going to move that way. So anyway, I think it's interesting, right? But when I talk about pact with the devil, I'm like, how do you create a profit incentive for the private sector to put 3x the capital to work against climate change that they're doing today? And I think that unlock would create all sorts of innovation around, the different areas for potential improvement.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing the thought process, because I feel like what you're sharing is also deeply personal, right? Like from your background, from what you know, from what you've seen in your career, you're grappling with those questions, maybe because that's where you feel you can make an impact. Sometimes the hardest questions are because that's the door to where your impact is actually lying, even though that's the thing that's bothering you and scratching and keeping you awake at night. I hope not. But having that personal reflection process and noticing that is a personal reflection in this Terra journey of, this is where I come from, and this is where I would like to make an impact based on what I've seen around me. So appreciate that. So again, we spoke a bit about loss and damage fund that was created at COP27. Alpo, I believe you brought that up. And like we saw in the chart before, 2013, it was 52 billion, and now we're almost at 90. And yet, in terms of reducing emissions and actual climate action, we are still only increasing. So where are those funds going? We have the money, it's doubled, it's increasing. Investments into climate funds are the fastest growing sector of all investment markets, at least from what I know, mostly in the US. And yet the change of global warming has seen little to no change. So what's happening there, right? What is really going on? I encourage you to look deeper into this. I do want to not run out of time for our next part of our class. It's super interesting. So let's take a screen break and come back at 11. And we have some fun surprises going on. So we'll come back at 10, if you can, 10:58 or 10:59. So a little graphic, a little climate comedy that might or might not make you smile, maybe not. Seeing people reading the news and watching everything happen, being part of that system and happening right in front of your eyes, and just saying, oh my goodness, what really can we do about it? So we have a bit of a guest speaker who's blessing us today. So I want to offer, yesterday I was chatting with Regine, we had a one-on-one, and I realized that she will be a really amazing person to talk about this topic, even better than me, as we go into speaking about the topic of development. So I want to open it up to Regine as we go into this part of development models and alternative models for human development. I'll open it up to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there might be some other folks here that have worked in like international development, and I'm really here to talk about like my experience and a lot of the development models and some of the questions we're posing are very high level. And I think that what I wanted to bring to this conversation around, these funds and, models and programs is that it's not necessarily enough to have the funding. I think Jesse had asked the question about, access to the funds and, what happens and, understanding what does that money do? Who does it go to? How do decisions get made around how it is even allocated and dispersed? So I wanted to just talk about my experience working in Haiti over the past 13 years. I worked for implementing partners with Chemonics, with DAI. And so a lot of, so one thing that article showed, I'll put the link in the chat, is 25, like less than 25% of these funds actually go to the countries that they're supposed to benefit. And in my experience, you know, one thing I was very surprised about when I started working for USAID projects is it is quite bold and center, like international development primarily supports the economic development and political priorities of the donor country. I think, you know, it brought my expectations to reality when I started to understand, you know, there's a lot of complaints, and I had complaints around like, you know, if this is supposed to help, why is this happening? How is this happening in this way? And I think like when you start to look at the strategic framework and the systems of international development and funds, how they flow, you start to understand who they benefit. So bilateral agencies, there's a great graph that I found that I'm going to put this in the chat around the breakdown of the flow of money. And here you can see like the bilateral development projects have the largest share. So bilateral development projects, oh, sorry, Apple, I sent that only to you. Those are implemented by partner government agencies. And that's who I worked for. So essentially most of the funds that are going to recipient countries are going through development agencies from the funder. And in my experience in Haiti, you know, I kind of traversed both worlds of coming from being raised in a very rich country and my culture, and where I've been and invested my life for the past 13 years is in one of the poorest countries in the world. And so I have experienced like firsthand understanding like how decisions are made. I think like personally, I've gone to being like, you know, naive to understanding how development can work and then how it cannot work. And I think a lot of ways that I have changed how, like my approach has been around impact. So I think that it takes a lot of effort. We're talking about the distribution of funds and people in their share. It takes a lot of effort to manage donor funds, right? So let's just say, let me give an example, because I know I'm saying a lot of different things right now, but let's just say, you know, this fund for climate change, it's established, there's $500 million there, $1 billion. But now it needs to get dispersed to the countries. I think who makes a decision about how that money flows is important. How that pie is sliced around who it goes to. The decisions around where that money is spent is also very important. Something that happens a lot in international development is the recipient country receives funding for something they may not even need. I have been, you know, I've worked for projects where it's like when you, in reality, when you get to that farmer, when you get to that community, they need a different irrigation system. They don't want seeds. But the seeds come from an American company, so that's what's given to them. So I think sometimes when we see these wonderful gains or ideas, what's really important, and I guess like my ask is maybe following that trail a little deeper. Like it's not enough that, you know, any given country gets, you know, the amount of money it's going to take, let's just say, to repair the damage of climate change. But it's also about the distribution of those funds. How do they get to the different areas? Who's implementing is also really important. If it's not a local implementer, it's a foreign implementer that sometimes don't speak the language, that don't understand the culture. So I think that you know, it may seem like a lot, but this is how international development essentially works and how it gets implemented. I've worked, yeah, I mean, I've worked with Dahlberg. They've been my clients. I've worked with USA. I've worked with lots of different partners. So I'm not trying to paint them as like, you know, like negative. I'm just talking about sometimes like the gains that we see and maybe how they don't translate to impact because the implementation and the decision-making and the allocation sometimes the political pressure on the government. There are all these different factors that can lead to more of the status quo. And I think that's really important when we're talking about climate, because those funds essentially are going to go through those same channels. And I think we also have to do some work in international development, to make this right and to make it different. So I know like other folks here have worked, with the different banks, I believe, and also, with other programs. But I think, we all have different experiences. Maybe the way it works in Haiti also doesn't work in other countries. So I'm not trying to paint this blanket, like statement of how it works. But I do think that there are things in practice that implementers, we stumble upon. So yeah, I'm going to drop the link for that article. I really just looked at this quickly yesterday to kind of share some information that can maybe prompt us to like look a little deeper into, okay, this fund is set, but then what? And how does the system already work and may need to change so that it can do what we all want it to do?
Thank you so much for that, for all of this illuminating experience. I think that that's a great 2 sentences that you said that stuck out to me, right? One, this fund is established, but now what? That's like a sentence that can be, I think, broadcasted across the whole world and anyone trying to make an impact. And you made me remember I was on a volunteering trip in Louisiana and New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina happened. It was actually not after, it was 10 years later. And I went to a soup kitchen, and you got there and it looks, I don't know if anyone's ever been to New Orleans, like everything's completely destroyed. It looked like the hurricane happened a few months ago. I remember we went to a soup kitchen, and the woman, she was like one of those earth angels that just has dedicated her whole life to helping the community, like a community weaver. And the way she set up the soup kitchen was like a supermarket. So when you get there, and you get there, you get a shopping cart, you have a row of bread, you have a row of vegetables, you have a row of fruit, and you go through, and each person has a certain amount that they're allowed to take, but they're allowed to choose. That's the whole point. And what she said is right, that it's reinstilling the dignity and the accuracy and eliminating all of the waste when you go to a place that you can pick out what you need, rather than here, have this boxed lunch, but you might be allergic to peanut butter, but here's a peanut butter sandwich. And even though it's a bit of a different, it's removed from the climate context, it's the point you brought up. How can we actually understand what people want? What do they need post-earthquake, post-disaster, for food management? So thank you so much for bringing that up. Does anyone have any thoughts or responses?
I think it reminds me of like Tom Shoes and sort of this wave of social entrepreneurship, which was really revolutionary at the time, 2008, 9, 10, roundabout there, but fast forward a few years later, you circulate a lot of photos of shoes that people don't need. And I think I'll share another interesting book. I think like that sort of value of choice is one of the kind of pros, like tallies in the pro column for like a universal basic income, which is a controversial idea, but I think is one that does like provide or like elevates choice in a way that's interesting and thought-provoking.
Will you write the book in the chat? So, for sure. And I'm adding all these things to the slides as we go. So if you're not remembering, it's going to be in the slides. Apple?
Yeah, no, I'm just reminded by your Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans. So I don't know if you all have seen the film Yes Men Change the World. It's an old film. I would highly recommend you watch that. So in that film, they actually went there and they showed that after this hurricane, Kazakhstan actually sent a bunch of yurts, which are these low-cost tents that can easily be set up, and it's good shelter for people. But everybody ignored them because they laughed at the idea. And what happened is that the government basically used the disaster as a way to take over of what was housing for a lot of sort of marginalized communities and profit from it, build commercial structures there. So I think that's kind of sadly what people in power will do if they're left unchecked. So I don't know how to counter for that, but yeah, I'm just sharing that.
I wanted to add something too, like in looking at some of the tables and the art and the resources that I put in the chat. One thing I also noticed is like at least for the OECD, the way that the countries are broken down also determines how they receive some of the funding. Like, you know, there's the bilaterals. There was also the multilaterals, which are like the development banks. And then there were, you know, where they get it back in loans. And then humanitarian assistance was pretty small. And then there was like a really tiny refugee piece where, you know, a country will get money for receiving refugees. And I think it's like what, low income, upper income, or upper middle income. And so there were like these 4 brackets. I had put that in the chat. And based off of that, there's the breakdown of like how they receive the funds. So that was something I thought that was interesting that I actually didn't know before. So in kind of looking into some resources, I thought that was yeah, an important piece. And I think Maria just put something in the chat about the money being left on the table because of procurement and bureaucracy. And a lot of times I've heard that like justify why you need those bilateral companies to implement programs. But there has been a push for like local solutions and local implementers. I've been a recipient of that. I've also seen how it doesn't work. And I think, and Jesse, you talking about like access to funds, I think that's one of the issues, like the access to funds requires systems that a lot of like small implementers don't have and would need to invest in. So that also creates, I guess, like the status quo of having to have, you know, a larger foreign, you know, basically bureaucratic, already have access to capital firm to come and actually implement the work.
Yeah. Maria?
Yeah, just a quick add. I think there's a huge disconnect between kind of who defines those funds, as Regina's saying, right? Who decides how much money goes where, and the actual recipients. So I used to work at USAID in Thailand, which is a regional mission, and basically Thailand is too rich to receive USAID aid, but there's like a few exceptions where they do. And we were supposed to be a regional mission helping, like a lot of our programs were actually climate related. But that team was always like struggling to get additional funding because most of the funding was going to like a very specific program that some congressman really liked and like cared deeply about in the US. And then that program had tons of money, and then the rest of the stuff that were kind of like the local organizations really wanted additional support, like USA didn't have the money. So it's just like a very interesting disconnect that is hard to navigate. Kind of when you're in the system, you can try to advocate for a lot of localization and kind of working closer with the communities, but then you have all these set of rules and parameters that it's hard to wiggle to work with.
Yeah, definitely. How we can reallocate seats at the table, I think, is a really important question. And just something came to mind before we're going to go into breakout rooms to discuss this further. Is sometimes it can feel, how are we going to, you know, make an impact on the institution that's already existing when people are so set in their ways and set in their minds. And something that we really need to keep on the forefront, and I believe in, is the power of education, right? If we're talking to our teenagers and our kids about these topics, eventually they will be the decision makers. And so I know sometimes it can feel a bit hopeless, like how are we going to change these institutions? But the future has really yet to be written. And we have an entire generation of children that are before us. And so if that's a way that you can integrate it into your climate journey, or you know someone who has the power to do so, who is a teacher, who is working in schools, how can you engage in a conversation, even if it's one time, and just maybe bring a little bit of impact? Because kids are the future of the future decision makers. And so putting that on the forefront and not taking that for granted or putting that as a less priority. Regine, thank you so much for that. I think we all really valued. we really got a lot of value from that. So I just want to keep blazing through, and we're going to go into a short breakout room. So there are some reference slides throughout the deck, so I'm not going to read through this because, again, it's very wordy. But the main point that we want to talk about is that our system, our economy, our capitalist system is not working well for everyone. I would go forth to say it's actually not working well for the majority. And thinking about what alternative models can we think about besides just traditional capitalistic growth, and what can we learn from that? And tying all of these things together, we spoke about mental models, we spoke about justice, we spoke about various solutions, and this ties into this idea that there's no one solution to climate change. Even if you're a hydrogen fan or a solar fan or a renewable energy person, right? That's not the key solution. We need integrative systems because we have very complex systems, and human beings are relatively complex, even though sometimes very simple people. So shifting our focus, instead of profiting from the destruction of the natural world, but building systems that can actually profit from the alignment with the natural world. So we spoke a couple weeks back very briefly about these development models that were put forth in your Terra class. So these four from Sri Lanka, from the US, donut economy. If you didn't have a chance to see the donut deep dive, I really recommend it. And the development plan in Costa Rica. So I'm gonna break us off into breakout rooms to discuss those models again, but to have these questions in your mind. One, do any of these models speak to you? But going beyond that, let's go into a more general development discussion, which is, what is the relationship? What are the trade-offs? If economic growth didn't happen in the environment, it didn't impact the environment, what would your position be? So just keeping these questions, and I made a slide for everyone to add on. If you have any development models from your local area or initiatives, they can be on the smaller scale side. Waste management, food management, cool companies you've heard about who are using food waste, please list them in here. You can do it while you're in the group, and let's learn even beyond these four models. Let's see inspiring action and movements of things that may really be working. So I'm going to break us down. Please look at slide. Let's keep the focus on question on slide 22. And there's some more questions in the speaker notes as well. I'm going to break us into groups. And we'll come back in around 5 minutes. All right. Okay. See you soon. Any illuminating takeaways that we had? Did we learn something new? Did we learn about any development places? Yeah.
Yeah, we had some good discussion, but it's a difficult topic, of course. I think was some kind of much more clear now that my initial thought of climate justice and climate change was like, let's just focus on climate change. If you bring another big theme in there, it's so much more difficult to get it realized. But since as soon as you're going to talk about cost and who's going to do what, climate justice or how to spread it is immediately on the table. And we had some discussion around, is it actually possible to make it more justice, or can we only get winning solutions if it's a win-win situation? So if, for example, new energy solutions are more cost-effective, cheaper, so that people will use it and it's better for them. And then we had some discussion that there might be change of behavior, which is not really making it worse for people. And so they might not improve in their situation, but at least not getting worse. So that's a lot of effort. So it's probably a combination of effort and then solutions that make things better for people, so they don't have to really spend more or invest more. If you want to change the world, probably otherwise it's not going to happen. We don't think the climate discussion will significantly change the just element in the next years. That was, I think, summary of our discussion. Yes, in Union, yeah.
Thanks, Michelle. Anyone else want to share any last takeaways? Okay. If any last models come to your mind, feel free to add them to slide 23. We're going to go.
Yeah. Don't think we have edit access, Kat, so we can't.
I don't have edit access? Okay, cool. So I will give you edit access. Thank you for that. This is just a brief graph about, wait, did I restate? Okay, perfect. Yeah. All right, so let's jump into the announcements. So this week we have class 13, energy electrifying everything is out today. It's going to be an interesting one, get a bit technical, I think interesting for a lot of people. We have our next Terra cohort beginning, gorillas they're called, which is kind of alarming because Terra tries to name them after sometimes endangered species. I'm not sure exactly which species of gorillas are endangered, but they are. Assignment 3 is due this Friday. I'm really looking forward to reading all of your assignments and seeing, the shift from assignment 1. Let me know if you're having any trouble. Please feel free to reach out. And assignment 4 opens on December 5th. So you have a gap in those days. We have a deep dive on economics and politics on November 30th. It ties super well into everything we're talking about: justice, system thinking, rethinking the lens. And a couple job fairs coming up. So highly recommend. Again, we had a mentorship session this week. So if you weren't able to attend, just make sure you're on the People Discovery tool and doing, as we said, you have the next couple months to meet with 4 mentors. So please be mindful of that. And next week, we're going to go into theory of change. We're not going to start it now. It's more of an action item. Thank you, everybody, for your participation today. Really, really, really is meaningful, I think, to everyone else in the room. I hope we feel good and that we're learning. And again, I'm actually going to leave you just with one more slide, as we like to do pathfinding. This is a pathfinding that you can take with us as you go forward in the week. You can use this as your climate date if you want, if you haven't done a climate date. Again, just going back, what was your primary objective? Where are you at now? What are your knowns? What do you already know? And what are your unknowns? What do you still hope to figure out? So just keep this with yourself. We're not going to do main room sharing. Use this, see where your journey's at. You can even draw your own arc and see, like, I started here. Maybe it went like this. Maybe it's still on the up. Maybe it's still on the down. Just keep checking in with yourself. And yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Yeah, and Regine said if anyone wants to connect with her one-on-one, please feel free to do that. Thank you so much, Regine.
Thank you.
Okay, have a great week. Anyone who still hasn't had a one-on-one, most of you have, but if you haven't, I'm here, and see you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.